Now we'll welcome Piper Winkler to the stage for opening remarks. Piper is a junior at Harvard College, majoring in comparative literature and also an organizer with Harvard for Bernie.
Hello, everyone. Before I begin, I want to clarify that my words are my own. They do not represent any of the organizations that are co-sponsoring this event. I want to thank you all for being at this conference tonight. The words of Eugene Debs in his Canton, Ohio speech feel appropriate in this moment. How good it is to look into your glowing faces this afternoon. You are all really good looking to me, I assure you. And I'm glad there are so many of you. Many of us have come together tonight, some no doubt interested to see how class warfare suits Harvard University. Since we announced this event, I've heard and seen people remarking with surprise and irony that Harvard should be the site of anything to do with the class war. But I assure you, nothing could be more at home at Harvard than the class war. It has been 384 years in the making. Perhaps you have read an article from one of our panelists, Megan Day. Defend Your Class, which ran in Jacobin last April. Defend Your Class is named for the slogan that inspired Harvard students to leave the classroom in 1912 and to take up arms with the National Guard to break the Lawrence Bread and Roses strike. What was the threat from which the class of the Harvard elite needed defense? It was a movement of the working class, men, women, and children, of 30 countries of origin, speaking 45 languages, demanding freedom from the daily threats to their lives posed by underpaid and dangerous jobs, and even more radically, the freedom to exist beyond the value assigned to their labor by the capitalist bosses. What was the value of those three words? Defend your class, to the Harvard undergraduate militiamen. Perhaps you know that hundreds of strikers were beaten and thrown in jail by the strikebreakers, and that 2 were murdered. For demonstrating their allegiance to their class, the Harvard students received course credit. You hear it said often now, and it has always been true. This is part of the legacy of a Harvard degree, of a Harvard education. Progress at Harvard, you may say, has surely taken place in the last 100 years, and I would say you are right. The Harvard brand has expanded fabulously in its prestige and in its power, and above all, it has progressed in its capacity to defend its class. About a mile from where we are gathered here, there's a new engineering school going up in Lower Alston, described by our president Bacow as a jewel of a building, $1 billion in its making. This complex has been described as the first inkling of Harvard's vision for a new Lower Alston, a new vision for one of the last affordable neighborhoods in Boston, while hundreds of our neighbors sleep on the streets every night. Now that is all just pretty talk for a class war. Progress indeed. Harvard's progress is not our progress. Has anyone watching our teaching fellows and course assistants strike in the yard for fair pay and decent health care? Has anyone watching this go on taken comfort in the fact that 62 of the world's current billionaires are Harvard affiliates, Harvard graduates? Who among us reads that the Harvard endowment has reached $40 billion in the fiscal year 2019 and celebrates, knowing that these dollars rebound from investments in the modern slavery of private prisons and the global destruction of fossil fuels? We do not, because Harvard's progress is not our progress. This institution stands rank and file with the National Guard of 1912, with the Henry Kissingers of 1969, and the war profiteering presidents of the 2000s, Republican and Democrat. And in these 384 years, it has not missed a single step. My task is not to build up a pile of evidence against Harvard out of hatred or spite. My point is far more important. What I want to illustrate for you is that the war-making, strike-breaking impulses of this institution are not random, they are not unrelated. In fact, they could not be more coordinated. What they show us is that Harvard is a case study in unity, and that unity is in the name of the almighty profit motive, the power of the next dollar and the dollar after that. That is what we all are worth to it. But every single one of you is worth the world to me. I hope that you feel that way about one another, because our shared future depends upon it. We can comfort, rally, mourn, and transform the face of the earth with this knowledge. Unity is not a substitute for solidarity. Unity is not a substitute for solidarity. In the words of St. Augustine, charity is not a substitute for justice. When our brothers and sisters in the homeless community walk into an apartment and call it home, we will say, this is justice and not charity. When working class children enroll in free college instead of in the army in order to build a better life, we will say, this is justice and not charity. When we realize and honor Fred Hampton's vision for a rainbow coalition against a racist police and incarceration system, against the starvation of children and against the commodification of healthcare, we will say, this is not charity, this is not generosity, this is not a concession, this is justice. Charity lets us know that we do not deserve so much as our own survival. In our time, the great crescendo of class warfare, something tells me that the powerful institutions of this world will continue to become ever less charitable. Let us take this thing out of their hands and into our own. Let us have justice, a justice made possible by solidarity. There is no substitute on earth for that. I am a literature student, and so of course, I am thinking of a verse written by the revolutionary poet W.B. Yeats. A verse that Yeats wrote in praise of a friend bred to a harder thing than triumph. As a volunteer for the Bernie Sanders campaign, I have knocked hundreds of doors in Iowa and in New Hampshire. I will not forget the Iowans that I met shortly before the new year. I spoke to a woman who shared that she was on leave from her low-wage job because a physical disability made the work too painful. But what decided her vote was the idea of a world in which she could afford mental health care. She told me about the struggles she faces every day to get out of bed. And then told me that on February 3rd, she would get out of bed, and then she would get into her car and drive to a caucus site where she will caucus for Bernie Sanders. She would do all of these things in the name of a harder thing than triumph. Let us remember, with fierce love and tenderness, the great anti-war activist Al Johnson, who canvassed among us in Nashua every weekend. Brother Johnson passed away on the first day of the new year. From his deathbed on December 31st, 2019, Brother Johnson made 200 phone calls for the presidential campaign of Bernie Sanders. Born to a Kentucky coal miner, growing up in the public housing of Massachusetts, he was imprisoned as a conscientious objector of the Vietnam War. He spent a year in that military prison for loving peace. Al Johnson was bred to a harder thing than triumph. Al Johnson was bred to solidarity his entire life. Let us be bred to a harder thing than triumph, the thing that makes triumph possible. Let it be solidarity. For then our work can never come to nothing. In the last day of his life, Al Johnson placed 200 calls in the name of a world that he would not live to see. What great certainty he had in those final hours. Not a certainty in victory, but a certainty in the value of your life and my life, in the right to live in peace. That is an endless victory that will outlast every brick and ivy leaf of this institution. Let us be so certain in our shared purpose and certain in our way forward. With every worker with temporary protected status, with every student with DACA status, with every climate refugee, with every community affected by the so-called war on drugs, with every union man and woman, we are certain that the world must change because we belong in it. The day will come when the working class lives in the housing it has built and benefits from the labor it has provided. We must work for that day together in solidarity, and we must accept no substitute. We must cast our votes for solidarity. We must cast our votes for solidarity in 2020, but this is only the beginning. Thank you.